So the guys over at Gigabyte have sent me out some really cool white components, and I've just discovered a really promising budget case from Antec. So I'm going to be putting all that together today and showing you step by step how to build an all-white PC in the Antec NX416L. For the motherboard, I'm going to be using the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite AX Ice. For the CPU, I'm going to be using Intel 14900K. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a 360mm I/O from Gigabyte. It's the Aorus WATERFORCE 2 360 Ice. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Renegade DDR5 RGB at 7200 megatransfers per second. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe drive from Samsung. It's their 990 Pro in 2TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a 1050 watt gold fully modular ATX 3.0 power supply from Thermaltake. It's their Tough Power GF-A3 Snow. And for the graphics card, I'm going to be using the Gigabyte Aero RTX 4070 Super. So we've got some absolutely amazing parts here. This PC is going to look so good. Let's make a start by taking a closer look at our case. So our tempered glass side panel is actually a door. We can simply open it up, and for the building process, it's removable by simply lifting it up. To remove our other side panel, we've got two non-captive thumb screws at the back we need to remove. And once these have been removed, we're going to be able to pull the panel backwards and lift away. If we take a look at the back of the panel we've just removed, you'll notice we've got this perforated area here, and there is a magnetically attached dust filter on it. And this indicates that we're going to be able to side mount fans or radiators in this case. If we take a look at our front panel, you notice we've got mesh on both the front and the side of the front panel. The front panel is easy to remove, it simply pulls off from the bottom. So if we take a look at the back of this panel, you'll notice there's no additional dust filters, and Antec are going with just mesh at the front. So with our front panel removed, you can see that Antec have installed two 160mm AirGB fans on the front of the case. Although if you prefer, you can mount up to three 140 or three 120mm fans, or up to a 360 or 280mm radiator. Taking a look at our case's top I/O, we've got a power button, we've got a button to cycle through the AirGB effects on the case's built-in controller. We've got a combined headphone and microphone jack, and a single USB Type-A and single USB Type-C port. On the top of the case, we've got a magnetically attached dust filter which can simply be pulled away. The radiator support at the top is the same as the front, up to a 360 or 280mm radiator, and while you can mount up to three 120mm fans at the top, you are limited to up to two 140mm fans. At the rear of the case, we've got another 120mm AirGB fan pre-installed. If you prefer, you can mount a 120mm radiator at the rear. On our power supply shroud, we are able to mount up to two 120mm fans. You can see we've got screw holes here for the fans. You're simply going to set your fans onto the power supply shroud, and then you're going to use the included long radiator screws that come in the case accessory box to go down through the fans and screw into the power supply shroud. And well done to Antec, we've got nice silver screws which are going to go well with the white case. And if you do want to go with fans on the power supply shroud, in terms of airflow, we've got this nice perforated area on the side of the case for them to intake air through. It is also possible to mount up to two 120mm fans or up to a 240mm radiator on the side of the case. But to do this, you're going to have to remove this cover plate. There's four screws on the back holding it on. And with the screws removed, we can simply lift the cover plate up and away to remove it. You can see now that's now going to give us the cutouts for mounting our two 120mm fans or up to a 240mm radiator. So if you're not going for fans and radiators on the side, as well as making your case look nice and tidy, this cover plate does have a hidden function, and you can actually mount two 2.5-inch drives to the back of it. And you'll see we've got little screw holes here for securing the drive, here and here. And we've got a little cutout here for bringing your cables out to the rear of the case. In terms of motherboard support, the case supports motherboards up to ATX in size, and if you want to go with the CPR cooler, the maximum height supported is 165mm. At the rear of the case, we've got 7 horizontal PCI expansion slot brackets, and in terms of graphics card support, the maximum length supported is up to 390mm with the front case fans installed. And we've got a nice cutout in the bottom of the case to bring your GPU power cables through. We've got a dust filter over our power supply's fan intake location, although this is just simply a sheet of mesh held on with clips at the side. Moving into our case's rear compartment, and we've got cutouts in sensible places through to the main body of the case, although not a rubber grommet in sight. In terms of cable tie-down points, these do look to be well located and there's plenty of them, although we don't have any Velcro cable straps included, although we do have standard plastic cable ties in the case accessory box. In terms of cable routing space, this looks like it should hopefully be adequate, but we'll see later on in the build. At the rear of the case, we've got a combined fan and ARGB hub, and we've got 6 3-pin connectors for our fans for powering them, and also 6 3-pin 5V ARGB connectors. Now you can see that our fans have 3-pin connectors on them, so we're going to have to run them in DC mode. You can see our case's reset switch is connected up to the top of the hub, so when we press that button on the top of the case, that's going to cycle through the ARGB effects on the controller. So we do have an empty port at the top, and there is a cable missing from my particular case. The cable coming from here, you're meant to plug into a fan header on your motherboard, and this allows your motherboard to control the speed of the fans on the controller. And we do like to take a look at our manual. It does mention this 4-pin connector to plug in to your motherboard. So unfortunately that just means my case is missing this cable, so I'm not going to be able to control the speed of the fans plugged in to the controller. So what I'm going to do is plug these fans directly into my motherboard. But you do have a cable coming from here. In your case, all you need to do is plug this into a fan header on your motherboard, and then you're going to be able to control all the fans plugged in to the controller via this cable. In terms of the 2 cables at the bottom coming from our controller, we've got a SATA power cable to power our hub, and we've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable, which if we plug into the ARGB header on our motherboard, we're going to be able to sync this up with our motherboard's ARGB. In terms of our other case cables, we've got a HD audio cable, which is going to control the combined headphone and microphone port on the front of the case. We've got our front panel connectors, which come as separate cables. We've got our USB 3.0 cable, which is going to let the Type A port on the top of the case work. And we've got our front panel Type C cable. And it's really impressive to see that Antec have color matched these cables to the color of the case. But unfortunately, the RGB cable coming from the controller and the PWM cable, if it was here, are black, so that's not going to look great. A little bit disappointing that they thought about the white case cables, but I forgot about the fan and RGB controller. Beside our fan and RGB controller, we've got a dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting bracket. It's held on with a captive thumb screw at the top. You're simply going to mount your drive on here, screw it in from the back before returning it. We've got a hard drive cage down at the bottom of the case. It's got one drive tray in it, and in here we're going to find our case accessory box. In the drive cage itself, you are able to mount either a 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drive, while on the top of the hard drive cage you can mount either a 2.5-inch drive or a 3.5-inch drive. If you do want to mount a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive on the top of the hard drive cage, you're going to have to screw it in from underneath, and that means removing the hard drive cage. It's held on with 2 screws at the bottom of the case, and then you're going to be able to pull the hard drive cage forward, lift it up and remove it. And if we take a look down at the bottom, you'll notice there's 2 different mounting locations for the hard drive cage, so it can be mounted further towards the front panel or further towards the power supply. Your power supply is going to go down at the bottom, and the case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 240mm, although if you remove the hard drive cage, you've got absolutely loads of space. And if we take a look at the back of the case, there's no removable power supply brackets. We're going to have to insert our power supply in from the side before screwing it in from the back. We're now ready to start work on our motherboard, and we're going to be installing our CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM before we put the motherboard into the case. To install our CPU, we need to open the socket cover by pushing the lever down and out, bringing it all the way to the top of the motherboard, and then we're going to be able to open the socket cover up. We can then take our CPU, holding it by the edges, and lower it down gently into the socket. Once we're happy it's sitting correctly, we can close the socket cover over. With the Intel boards, I do like to apply a little bit of pressure here to get the black bit of plastic to pop off at this stage. We'll put this in our motherboard box for safekeeping, and then we can close the lever to secure the CPU in the socket. Next, we've got our M.2 SSD to install, and we've got 4 M.2 slots in the motherboard, 1 behind this top heatsink and 3 behind this bottom heatsink. Now, they aren't created equally. They're all Gen 4x4 slots, but the PCIe lanes for the top slot come directly from the CPU, while the ones from the bottom slots come via the chipset. So as we've only got 1 drive, we're going to be installing it in the top slot. So to remove our heatsink, there's a screw on one side we need to remove. And then with the screw removed, we're going to be able to tilt the heatsink up and lift it away. So you'll notice there's a heat pad on the back of the socket, so there is some plastic protection on it we're going to need to remove. We can then slide our M.2 SSD into the socket. And once we've inserted it into the socket, one of the really cool things these clips that Gigabyte use, all we need to do is push our drive down, and the clip is automatically going to lock into place, holding our drive in the socket. To remove it, all we need to do is push the clip to the side and it's going to pop up. So really one of the simplest methods for mounting your M.2 SSDs. Again, on the back of the heatsink, we've got some plastic protection we need to remove. We can then replace our heatsink, so there's a little metal clip which just slides into here, And then we're going to be able to lower the drive down into place. Because we've only got 2 sticks of RAM, we're going to be installing it in the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU, so we can open the clips on these slots. Then we can take our RAM, line it up with the slot, and once we're happy everything's lined up with some firm pressure to the RAM, and it's going to clip into place. The same thing with our 2nd stick. So because we've got an Intel motherboard, we're going to need to install our backplate, and this backplate is compatible with both LGA 1200 and LGA 1700 motherboards. We've got an LGA 1700 motherboard. If you've got an LGA 1200 motherboard, you're going to want to have all these pins toward the middle setting, but for LGA 1700 like we have, we're going to want to pull them all towards the outer setting. And then if we go ahead and turn our bracket over, with the pins all in the outer setting, it should fit through the holes in the back of the motherboard. Next thing to do is screw one of these spacers onto each corner. And again, which of these you use depends on which Intel motherboard you have. If you've got an LGA 1200 socket, you're going to want to use the silver spacer. And if you've got an LGA 1700 socket like we do, it's the darker black spacers that you're going to want to use. Next, we can set our motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs at the back, and then we're going to secure it into place with 9 of the screws with a little lip around the outside from the case accessory box. Next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. Our HD audio cable is going to go to this header down the bottom left hand side of the motherboard with the HD audio text facing down the way. We've got an ARGB header here down at the bottom, so we'll bring the ARGB cable coming from our fan hub through, line it up and push into place. Our front panel connectors are going to go to this header down the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, so we'll bring the cables through the cutout. And working along the bottom row from left to right, pins 1 and 2 are for HD audio positive and HD audio negative, so we're going to need to plug it in with the text facing down the way. Then moving up to the top row, pins 1 and 2 from the left hand side are for power LED positive and power LED negative. And next to that in the top row is our power switch. And then we can just pull all our excess cable through to the back. We've got our front panel type C header here, so we can bring our cable through the cutout, line it up and push into place. Our USB 3.0 cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place. And then we'll just pull all the excess cable through to the back. So we've got some fan headers down the bottom of the motherboard, and if your controller does come with the required cable, just plug it into one of the fan headers. Because mine didn't, I'm going to plug in each of my case fans separately. We're now ready to install our power supply, and I've gone ahead and plugged in the cables that we're going to need. So I plugged in a 12 volt high power cable to power our graphics card. We've got 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to our CPU, our 24-pin motherboard cable, and I plugged in a SATA power cable to power our case's built-in fan and ARGB hub. One additional thing to point out about our power supply, it does have a smart zero fan mode, so whenever the power supply is under low load, the fan will stop spinning, helping reduce noise in the build. So we're definitely going to want to turn this on. Just before we put our power supply in the case, it's important to point out that this is our power supply's intake fan, so we're going to want to install it with the fan facing down where it can get cool air from underneath the case. We can then secure the power supply into place with 4 of the power supply screws from the case accessory box. Our 2 8-pin EPS cables are going to go into these headers at the top left of the motherboard, so we can go ahead and bring them through the cutout, line them up with the headers and push into place. And then we'll just pull all the excess cable through to the back. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place. And again, we'll just pull the excess cable through to the back. At the back of the case, we need to remember to plug the SATA cable coming from our case's fan and ARGB hub into a SATA cable coming from our power supply. We're now ready to start working on our AIO, and the first thing for us to do is join our fans together. If I turn them around to the side, you see there's little connectors on the side, so they are going to daisy chain together. So it's just a simple matter of lining the fans up and pushing down to lock them into place. And that's all 3 of our fans joined together. On the end of our fans, we get this connector here, and we just take this cable, we're going to line it up and then push down to lock it into place. Coming from the connector, we've got 2 different cables. We've got a 4-pin PWM connector, which we're going to plug into our CPU fan header, and that's going to allow us to power the fans and also control their speed. And we've also got a 3-pin 5-volt ARGB cable, which is going to go into an ARGB header on our motherboard, allowing us to adjust the lighting on the fans. In the box with the AIO, we get this 2-to-1 ARGB cable. So what we can do is take one of the connectors off, And then we can take our ARGB cable coming from the fans and plug it into the cable. And that's going to leave us a spare connector, which we're going to need when we come on to our pump. So coming from our pump, we've got two cables. We've got a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable, and if we daisy chain this into the cable coming from our fans, it's going to allow us to control the lighting effects on the pump. The other cable is a 4-pin PWM connector, and if we plug this into our motherboard's pump header, it's going to allow us to control the speed of the pump. So next thing for us to do is to put the bracket onto your pump, which is going to allow us to secure it to the motherboard. So I'm going to be showing you how to install the Intel bracket. It's just a matter of lining it up with a little slot on the side, and then we give it a little bit of a push, and it's going to clip into place. So next we can set our fans onto the radiator, and we can secure the fans into place using the long radiator screws that came with the AIO. Then we can set our AIO into place at the top of the case, and we can secure it into place at the top using the short radiator screws. Now our AIO does come with these little washers which you could put in between the screw and the case. The reason I haven't is the type of dust filter that we have at the top. If we were to raise these screws up higher, it might interfere with the dust filter coming down. And we can then replace our top dust filter. Next, I'm just going to pass the cables coming from the radiator through the cutout at the back. Next, we can add some thermal paste to the center of the CPU. Remember, before installing our AIO, it is important we remove the plastic protection. And in terms of the cables coming from the AIO, I just like to wrap them up around the pump bracket, making sure they're not on the cold plate. And then we just need to line the pump up with the bracket on the motherboard. And we're then going to want to get a thumb screw onto each corner. And then we're just going to want to tighten each corner up in turn. Up at the top of the case, we've got our CPU fan header and our CPU opt header just to the left. So I'm just going to plug the cable coming from the pump into the CPU opt header. I'm going to pass our ARGB cable up and through to the back and just tidy up the excess cable coming from our pump cable. Our CPU fan header is this one here, so I'm going to bring the cable coming from the fans and the radiators back through. We'll line the cable up with the header and push into place, and then just pull the excess cable through to the back. Next to that, we've got an ARGB header, so we'll bring the double splitter cable back through and get it plugged into here. If the logo on your pump isn't sitting the right way round, it is rotatable. It's just a matter of rotating it round and getting it into the exact position you want it to be in. We just need to get the ARGB cable from our pump plugged in, so we can remove the plastic protection from the double splitter cable, line the two cables up and push into place. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so to get access to the slots we're going to have to loosen this thumb screw. That is then going to allow us to pull this back here. So you will be able to get a screwdriver through here to get access to the screws. I normally find with these little covers it's sometimes easier just to take them off. And then we're going to remove the second and third slot cover from the top. We can then open the clip in the top PCIe slot on the motherboard. We can then take our graphics card and line it up with the slot. And once we're happy we've got it in place, it's just some firm pressure and it's going to clip into place. And then we can secure it into place with the two screws we've just removed. And then we can replace our cover. We can then bring our 12-volt high power cable through the cutout, line it up with the graphics card and push into place. So you notice on our 12-volt high power cable, the 4 pins at the top is a separate cable. So all I'm going to do is use a cable tie to tidy these together. And the other important thing is we're just going to want to make sure we're not making too big of a bend in this cable near the graphics card. So you'll notice I decided not to use this cutout for our GPU cables. Because our cables are coming out into the middle of the graphics card, it just wouldn't look right running from here to here. It was just easier to bring it directly in from the back. Okay, last thing to do is some cable management and get the panels back on again. So that's the build complete and looking absolutely stunning. I've gone ahead and got the BIOS updated to the latest version, adjusted the BIOS settings, and then when you load into Windows, Gigabyte Control Center is going to pop up allowing you to download your drivers and adjust your RGB. And it really was just one click and we were able to get all the lighting set to white. And that really is one of the big advantages of getting all your components from the same manufacturer. You've got one bit of software and that's going to let you control the lighting on everything. And I think this PC looks absolutely stunning in white. In terms of using the case buttons, you just need to press the LED button on the top of the case to cycle through the RGB effects on the fans plugged into the controller. And then if you hold the button in for 3 seconds, it's going to sync everything on the controller with your motherboard. So I'm not planning on doing a full software setup today. I've done this previously, and what I will do is put a link in the video description that covers all this if you don't know how to do it. So in terms of thermal testing, what I normally do is run a 10-minute AIDA64 stability test with all components in the system being stressed. So every time I tried to run the test, very shortly after starting the test would stop itself. The system didn't thermal throttle, the test just terminated. And when you look at the temperature of the CPU, it wasn't really reaching that high a temperature. I did have a bit of a play in the BIOS settings trying to figure out why it was doing this, but I wasn't able to work this out. I did run Cinebench and everything did seem to be running fine, so I just couldn't explain why AIDA64 was stopping the test when the temperatures weren't that high. What I am able to share with you is the GPU temperatures. So our 4070 Super idled at 28 degrees and reached a maximum of 61 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise levels, we had an average noise level of 37 decibels at idle and 52 decibels under load. So I'm not planning on doing a separate case review, but what I will do for a couple of minutes now is share my thoughts on the case. And really with this case, I do have mixed feelings on it. There's an awful lot of brilliant features in this case. First of all, I do think it is a pretty good looking case, particularly given it costs less than £80 at the moment. It's good to see it comes with 3 included case fans with ARGB on them. I really like that little cover plate at the front. If you're not going to have fans at the side, it improves the looks and improves the airflow in the case. But as well, it's also really smart to include 2 SSD mounts behind it. I also think Antec have thought quite a bit about this case in terms of getting all the case cables matched up to the case colour in white for this particular case, including the screws for mounting your fans on the bottom of the case. And I also think having the screws in silver was also a good choice. There are 4 things that I did find a little bit disappointing with this case, and I think if Antec had have addressed these, they could have had an absolutely brilliant case on their hands. The first really disappointing thing for me was the fact that the case fans came with 3-pin connectors on them, so you are going to have to run them in DC mode, and your idle speed is going to be much higher than what it would have needed to be with PWM fans. The second thing I found a little bit disappointing was the colour of the cables coming from the fan and the ARGB hub, particularly given that Antec had done such a brilliant job with the case cables and matching them to the colour of the case. To just have standard black cables coming out of that ARGB hub was just really disappointing, and it was going to spoil the look of the build. Another thing that I think they could have done to improve the aesthetics of the build would have been to have some rubber grommets just over that right hand side of the motherboard, and it would have hid all the cables being managed at the back behind the large cutouts. The final thing that I found a little bit disappointing was the fact that we had non-captive thumb screws on the side panel, and even a lot of budget cases nowadays are using much better modern mechanisms for securing the panels. So really mixed feelings on this case. When you factor in the price point at less than £80, you really are getting what you pay for, and you're getting good value for money. But it's just a little bit disappointing because Antec had seemed like they had thought so hard about some of the decisions in this case, and others they had just ignored. And like I say, I think those 4 things, if they had been changed, you could potentially have had a budget case of the year. Is it still worth buying? Most definitely. It's an absolutely budget price and you're getting an absolutely cracker looking case. I'm just a little bit disappointed because I think a few small changes and it would have been absolutely brilliant. So hopefully you have enjoyed this full step-by-step PC build guide. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.